He had mapped the entire world. Every country, every city, every road. Thomas had spent 30 years bent over his desk, pen in hand, creating the most detailed maps ever drawn. Mountains he'd never climbed, oceans he'd never sailed, cities he'd never walked through. But on paper, he knew them all perfectly. His studio was filled with maps, walls covered floor to ceiling, drawers overflowing, tables buried under precise drawings of places he'd documented but never seen. People came from everywhere to buy his maps. Travelers, explorers, adventurers planning their journeys. "Your maps are incredible," they'd say. "So detailed, so accurate. You must have traveled everywhere." Thomas would smile, adjust his glasses, and lie. Yes, everywhere. But the truth was, Thomas had barely left his city. The farthest he'd traveled was to the library 3 blocks away to study other people's maps, other people's journals, other people's lives. He wasn't a traveler. He was a copier, a documenter, a man who knew every road in the world except the one that led out his own front door. Thomas told himself it was about the work, about perfection, about creating something lasting. But deep down, he knew the real reason. He was afraid. Afraid of the mess of real life, of things not going according to plan, of getting lost, of not being in control. Maps made sense. Maps had rules. Maps could be perfected. Life was chaos. So Thomas chose paper over experience, plans over adventure, control over living. Every morning, same routine. Wake up, coffee, studio, draw, document, perfect. Every evening, same routine. Organize maps, study routes, plan journeys he'd never take. 30 years of this. 30 years of mapping a world he was too afraid to enter. His friends stopped inviting him places. "Thomas doesn't leave his studio," they'd say. "Thomas is married to his maps." They weren't wrong. The maps were his life, his identity, his excuse for never having to actually live. One day, a young woman came to buy a map of the coastal road. "I'm planning to walk it," she said, eyes bright with excitement. "Your map will guide me." Thomas sold her the map, watched her leave, and felt something he'd buried for 30 years. Envy. She was going to walk a road he'd drawn but never seen. She was going to live an adventure he'd only documented. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stood in his studio, surrounded by thousands of maps, maps of everywhere, maps of everything. And he realized something that made his chest tight. He had documented the entire world, but he had lived none of it. The fire started in the middle of the night. Electrical fault, old building, dry paper everywhere. By the time Thomas woke up, his studio was engulfed in flames. He tried to save them, ran into the smoke, grabbed maps, but there were thousands, and the fire was faster. He stood in the street, watching 30 years of work burn. Every map, every document, every precise line he'd ever drawn, gone. The firefighters saved the building structure, saved his living quarters, but the studio, the room that held his entire life's work, was destroyed. Thomas stood in the ashes the next morning, numb. 30 years, gone in 3 hours. His insurance would cover the financial loss, but it couldn't replace the maps. Each one was an original, irreplaceable. A neighbor found him there, standing in the ruins. So sorry, Thomas. Your life's work." "It wasn't my life's work," Thomas said quietly, and surprised himself by saying it. "What?" "It was documentation of other people's lives. I never—" He trailed off. The neighbor didn't understand, but Thomas did. The fire had destroyed his maps, but the world they represented, that was still there, untouched, waiting. Thomas went back to his apartment, sat at his empty desk. No maps, no plans, no documentation, just silence. And for the first time in 30 years, possibility. A dangerous thought crept in. What if I just went somewhere? Not to document it, not to map it, just to see it, experience it, live it. The thought terrified him. No plan, no route, no map to follow. But he also felt something else, something he hadn't felt in decades. Curiosity. That coastal road the young woman had bought a map for, the one he'd drawn so carefully, measuring every curve, every elevation, every turn. He knew it perfectly on paper, but what did it actually look like? What did it feel like to walk it? Thomas packed a small bag, some clothes, some money, no maps, no itinerary, no plan. His hands shook as he locked his door. No control, no certainty, no knowing what would happen. 30 years of careful planning, all left behind. He got on a bus heading to the coast, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea where he was really going. The road looked nothing like his map. In his drawing, it was a clean line, precise measurements, calculated curves. In reality, it was messy, beautiful, alive. There was a tree he'd never marked, because how do you draw the way light filters through leaves? There was a view he'd never noted, because how do you measure the feeling of seeing the ocean for the first time? There was a small cafe he'd never included, because who documents the taste of bread still warm from the oven? His map had been accurate, but it had been dead. Thomas walked that coastal road for 3 days. No schedule, no plan, just walking. And something broke open inside him. This was what he'd been avoiding. This mess, this uncertainty, this not knowing what was around the next corner. This living. Thomas traveled for 6 months. No maps, no plans, just choosing directions that felt right, following recommendations from strangers, getting lost and finding his way. He climbed mountains, not to measure them, to feel small beneath their peaks. He sailed across oceans, not to chart them, to feel the spray of salt water on his face. He walked through cities, not to document them, to hear the music, taste the food, talk to people whose lives were nothing like his maps had suggested. And everywhere he went, he discovered the same thing. Life doesn't fit on paper. You can't map spontaneity. You can't chart a conversation with a stranger that changes your perspective. You can't measure the feeling of watching a sunset from somewhere you'd never planned to be. The map would have told him where to go, but living told him who to become. One evening, in a small mountain village he'd never heard of, Thomas sat with an old woman who'd lived there her whole life. "What brings you here?" she asked. "I don't know," Thomas said, and laughed, because it was true, and it was wonderful. "I spent 30 years planning journeys I never took, drawing roads I never walked. Now I'm just walking, without knowing where I'm going." The woman smiled. "And how does it feel?" Thomas thought about it, about the fear at the beginning, about the control he'd lost, about all the uncertainty and mess and unpredictability. "It feels like living," she said. "That's because it is," she replied. "Plans are for avoiding life, young man, not for living it." Thomas returned to his city a year after the fire. His studio was rebuilt, empty, waiting. People asked if he'd make maps again. No, he said. I'm done documenting. I think I'd like to try living instead. Some people didn't understand, but you were the greatest cartographer. That was your purpose. Thomas smiled, because now he knew the truth. Mapping wasn't his purpose. It was his excuse. His purpose wasn't something he could draw or plan or control. His purpose was to experience, to connect, to be present in moments he could never have mapped. He did eventually return to drawing, but not maps. He drew the feeling of conversations, the memory of tastes and sounds, the essence of moments that no map could ever capture. Were they accurate? No. Were they perfect? No. Were they alive? Yes. And that made all the difference. Thomas learned what so many of us need to learn. Purpose isn't found in planning your life perfectly. Purpose is discovered by living imperfectly. It's not about having a map for every step. It's about taking steps without knowing exactly where they lead. Plans give us the illusion of control, but control isn't the same as living. So, if you're watching this and you're stuck in planning mode, making lists, drawing maps, organizing your future, always preparing but never actually starting, ask yourself, am I planning to live, or am I planning instead of living? Because life isn't a map. It's not meant to be documented before it's experienced. Life is meant to be messy, unpredictable, and beautifully alive. Thomas spent 30 years mapping the world, and 1 year living in it. That 1 year taught him more about purpose than 30 years of careful planning ever could. Your purpose isn't waiting at some perfectly planned destination. It's in the walking, the stumbling, the getting lost and finding new paths. It's in the conversations you didn't schedule, the places you went on a whim, the moments you couldn't have controlled if you tried. Stop mapping. Start walking. Stop planning. Start living. Your purpose isn't on the paper. It's out there, waiting for you to stop documenting and start experiencing. Subscribe for more stories about finding meaning and living authentically. And comment below, what's one step you've been planning forever but never taking? Because that might be exactly where your purpose is hiding, waiting for you to stop drawing the map and just walk the path.